My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the Vienna launch of the 2020 Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor edition. It is the third time we are hosting the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor in the VCDNP events, and it seems like it's already became a tradition. So it's always good to see you, Grethe, Stuart, and welcome, Bonnie. But this year is a little bit different. This is the first time we focus on the tracking that the ban monitor does after the treaty has already entered into force in January of this year. The way we will structure today's event, we'll have a few introductory remarks from several ambassadors, and then we will have the presentation of from the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor team and a moderated discussion. So it is my greatest pleasure to introduce our representatives from the diplomatic missions here and from the Foreign Ministry of Austria. We'll hear the introductory remarks from Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, who is Director for Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the Federal Ministry of European and International Affairs here in Vienna, in snowy Vienna, despite April date. Then we'll hear from Ambassador Nicole Roberton, who is resident representative of New Zealand to the international organizations here in Vienna, and Ambassador Eoin O'Leary, resident representative of Ireland to the international organizations in Vienna. And the event today will be moderated by my great colleague, Gaukhar Mukhatzhanova, who is director of our program on international organizations in non-proliferation. But before I do that, I also want to especially thank Ambassador O'Leary and your team for the facilitation of this event and assistance in its organization. So with these few remarks, I'm passing the floor to Gaukhar so that she can moderate today's discussion.
Thank you, Elena, and welcome everybody to the third Vienna launch of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. I'm very pleased to have you all with us, albeit virtually. And as advertised, we'll have introductory remarks from 3 ambassadors, followed by presentations on the substance of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. And I am pleased to give the floor first to Ambassador Alexander Kmentt, who is known to many of you as one of the key figures in the humanitarian initiative that eventually led to the negotiations of the TPNW. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon, Gaukhar, and good afternoon to all colleagues. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and it's a real pleasure for me to participate in the launch of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. Austria is pleased to support the Ban Monitor together with the governments of Ireland and New Zealand. As was mentioned by Elena, the TPNW is now in force and is a reality, so to say, under international law. And the focus has now shifted from achieving the entry into force of the treaty to its implementation. And in this context, the first meeting of states parties will, of course, be of crucial importance. It is, according to the treaty, has to take place within a year of entry into force. And it will take place in January 2022 in Vienna. And I have the honor of having been nominated as president-designate of this conference. And wanted to inform you that preparations have started already with informal consultations of states parties and signatories. It is, of course, a challenging preparatory process at the moment due to the pandemic restrictions, but there's also a high degree of enthusiasm and focus to work together to make the first meeting of states parties as successful as possible. What I've heard so far from states parties and signatories in the consultations is the strong commitment to have a well-prepared, a substantive and a serious meeting. I've heard a clear conviction that the first meeting of states parties and the subsequent implementation of the TPNW should continue to be grounded in the human security arguments on which the TPNW is based. And this means, of course, putting a strong focus on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the risks to all humanity associated with the possession of nuclear weapons and security policies based on nuclear deterrence. There's need for more research and need for a broadening of the discussion on these aspects, and that's been clearly expressed as necessary. States have also expressed their wish to put a strong emphasis on the positive obligations of the TPNW, which is victim assistance and environmental remediation coming from nuclear explosions, and on the universalization of the TPNW itself and of the human security discourse that underpins it. There's also a clear commitment to continue working in the TPNW context in the same inclusive and democratic and open manner that has characterized the process leading to the treaty, which means openness towards contributions from civil society organizations and academic experts, which are and have been very important partners in our endeavor of promoting the treaty and the rationale of the treaty. At the same time, there's strong interest in engaging with those who are currently not yet supporters, emphasis on yet, of the TPNW, and to encourage their participation at the first meeting of states parties as observers. We will hold a series of informal consultations for states parties and signatories until the summer to discuss all the organizational and substantive aspects of the first meeting of states parties and also the expectations of states parties regarding the outcome of the meeting. And by summer, we hope that the pandemic situation will have eased and will allow the planning for proper in-person preparatory consultations for the second half of the year, which we really hope, because as I said, it is a bit of a challenge to break new ground in a sort of virtual meeting format only. The strong focus on the implementation of the TPNW is also where the role of the nuclear ban monitor comes in and is so important. The ban monitor assesses and evaluates the practice and policies of all states in relation to the norms enshrined in the TPNW, whether they are states parties or not. And this makes the ban monitor not a very helpful tool for all, for officials, for academic, for civil society. It's a very important resource, and it's a reference point for the implementation of the TPNW for states parties, but also for targeted efforts for the universalization of the treaty and to engage different stakeholders in the arguments and the norms of the TPNW. And I would like to highlight in particular the solid foundation of the ban monitor in legal expertise, which I think is very important. So let me close by congratulating the many and thanking the many contributors who've pulled this impressive piece of research together. And I close by saying I look forward to the substantive presentations and the discussions that we'll have afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this introduction and for the update on the preparations for the first meeting of states parties. Even before the webinar started, we were already receiving questions about the meeting of first meeting of states parties. So it's really very useful to receive this information. Thank you. Next, I would invite Ambassador Nicole Roberton, who is resident representative to the international organizations in Vienna of New Zealand, as we established the only country in the world that has a designated minister for disarmament. That's how important these issues are to New Zealand. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Gaukhar. Kia ora koutou katoa to all of you. First up, thank you to VCDNP for everything that you have organised today, Gaukhar, Elena, and your teams. What a fantastic opportunity to discuss these important issues. And most importantly, can we congratulate the Norwegian People's Aid on the launch of this year's nuclear weapons ban monitor. Ambassador Kmentt has just outlined perfectly the value of this work, and we are really pleased, along with Austria and Ireland, to be able to support this project, which really resonates with our long-standing advocacy for nuclear disarmament. As I think you all know, disarmament issues, non-proliferation issues are so close to New Zealand's heart. And as Gaukhar just mentioned, we have actually just recently reappointed the standalone position of Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control in New Zealand, the Honourable Phil Twyford. So just the sheer fact that we have a minister, a government minister for these issues, I hope really underscores for you how seriously New Zealand takes these issues, and the TPNW in particular. Our minister is active, to say the least, she says with some nervousness, and he is taking a really strong interest in our work here in Vienna and also in Geneva and in New York. So you'll be hearing a lot from him in the next few years. New Zealand, as you know, really proud to have been a member of the core group of states that support the treaty. And I wanted to say that we really value in particular our important partnership with civil society, with whom we've had the opportunity to advance the treaty and give reality to its objective and its purpose. Civil society really is the key, in our view, to the success of the treaty. Governments can do some things, but civil society really is the way that this makes its way through into communities and large-scale change is possible. So it's fantastic to be able to take this project forward together with all of the different strands. We're really pleased to see 22nd of January 2021 immortalised in the Monitor as the date of the entry into the force of the treaty. And from our perspective, the TPNW reminds us that even when progress is slow and it's hard fought, you actually can achieve things in the multilateral environment when you all come together. And we're all aware that it's a tough time sometimes for multilateralism, but the TPNW really is one of the success stories of recent years. So not only is it advancing things in our view in terms of disarmament, but it's also strengthening the arm of the multilateral system more broadly, which is critically important. I also just wanted to touch on the fact that we as New Zealand have really enjoyed working with our Pacific partners on TPNW. And we find it really fitting that in our region, which has suffered the effects of nuclear testing in appalling ways, that this region has been advocating passionately for nuclear disarmament for so long. And now Pacific states make up 20% of the states whose ratifications have brought the TPNW into effect. And we're super proud to have this Pacific voice so strongly visible on these issues. These are not historical issues for the Pacific. These are current, the ongoing legacy issues in our region of Pacific testing, of nuclear testing, are very real. And you will see the Pacific continue, I think, to be very energized on these issues going forward. More broadly, we're just more motivated than ever to keep building support for the treaty. And the ban monitor is a really valuable resource to draw on in this work as we come together in preparation for the first meeting of the states parties. Congratulations to you, Ambassador Kmentt, on your role and Austria's leadership in this. I think I've already said to you privately that our minister is very jealous that we weren't, as officials, we failed him by not getting off the mark fast enough, but we couldn't be in better hands with you in this role. We're looking forward to the COSP, and we will be actively participating. And in closing, just one more time, we're so grateful to the Norwegian People's Aid for your tireless efforts to draw together and analyse the data that we need and to produce this excellent resource. And it is going to be of huge value to all of us in the coming years. So congratulations and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. The next welcoming remarks will be from Ambassador Honorary, who is a resident representative of Ireland with international organizations in Vienna. Ireland is a country whose diplomats often say that disarmament and non-proliferation runs in their DNA, having had something to do not only with the TPNW, but also with the initiation of the negotiations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty some 60 years ago. So I'm very pleased to have you join us. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you, Gaukhar. Can you all hear me? Very good. And thank you, Elena and the team for hosting this today. We're delighted once again to support the launch of the Nuclear Ban Monitor. And we would we also thank Norwegian People's Aid for this launch, and indeed the launch in previous years. In this regard, I should also congratulate Ambassador Kmentt on his receipt of the Simons Foundation Award from Canada. Well done on that, Alexander. Well recognized and well merited. Nuclear disarmament, as you say, Gaukhar, and non-proliferation have been a policy priority for Ireland since the 1950s. Indeed, in the 60s, when the NPT was being formed, it was based around a motion called the Irish Resolution. And our minister at that time was invited to sign the NPT when it was formally signed in 1968 in recognition of that. We see the TPMW as an extension of our long-held view that a world without nuclear weapons can and must be achieved. Ireland was proud to ratify the TPMW on the 6th of August last year, the 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb explosion. We were also very happy that the TPMW came into force this year on the 22nd of January. Ireland is particularly conscious of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. As long as these weapons exist, the possibility of their use will remain like a sword of Damocles over the human race. They are the last weapons of mass destruction to be banned by an international treaty, and in particular, Ireland has always recognised the disproportionate impact of ionizing radiation on women and girls who suffered most following Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a suffering which continued indeed for many decades afterwards. The Nuclear Ban Monitor provides a comprehensive and concise overview of key treaty issues and serves as an accessible and trustworthy resource for a diverse group of stakeholders, including governments, parliamentarians, NGOs, the media, the academic community, and indeed anybody in civil society with an interest in nuclear disarmament. It has an important role to play in promoting public awareness about nuclear disarmament and in shaping the conversation around the TPMW itself. The Ban Monitor can also act as a capacity building resource for non-nuclear weapon states participating in disarmament discussions and disarmament decision making. Another valuable feature of the Monitor is its forward planning, particularly its recommendations to the first meeting of state parties, which will be chaired by Ambassador Kmentt next January. Ireland greatly looks forward to participating in this COSP. Why do we see the TPMW as necessary? Because the implementation of the nuclear disarmament obligation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty remains unsatisfactory. That is the main aim of the TPMW and indeed the main aim of everybody in the world. Existing commitments have not been fulfilled and are being called into question by the words and actions of some states. In this situation, it is more urgent than ever to strengthen the international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime with the NPT as its cornerstone. The TPMW does exactly this. In particular, the new treaty complements and strengthens the NPT in at least two ways. Firstly, it provides a legal framework for the implementation of Article 6 of the NPT. And secondly, the TPMW strengthens the IAEA safeguard system based on the NPT. It reaffirms the safeguard standards enshrined in the NPT Article 3, obliges states which already have a higher standard in place to maintain it, and encourages all states to further raise their level of commitment in terms of safeguards. We realize, of course, that for this to be effective, we have to listen carefully to the criticism of those states that do not wish to participate in the TPMW, and to seek, as we are very keen indeed, to engage these states in a conversation and hopefully persuade them over time of the merits of the treaty. One of the main criticisms is that the TPNW undermines the NPT and the CTBTO. This is not so. We see all three instruments as working together towards our common aim of a nuclear weapon-free world. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I hope that in this discussion section, we'll have time to address further some of the questions around the interplay between the TPNW and the NPT and other elements of the regime. But before that, we will have the presentations from the people who actually put together the nuclear weapons ban monitor. And first among them, I'm pleased to welcome Ms. Grethe Østern, who's the editor of the nuclear weapons ban monitor, and she's with the Norwegian People's Aid. Grethe, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Gaukhar. We're so grateful to you, Elena, and your colleagues for hosting this event today. I also want to thank our donors, of course, Austria, Ireland, New Zealand, and Norway for supporting our research. Time flies, and this is already the third edition of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. We've continued to increase the number of legal and technical experts that contribute with data collection and analysis for it. And we plan to draw in even more for the work on the next edition, which will be ready for the first meeting of states parties. And now, Alex, I also know when the deadline for that is. Can I have the first slide, please? Yes, well, the second slide. Thank you. The purpose of our research is to track progress towards a world without nuclear weapons and to highlight activities that stand between the international community and the fulfillment of that goal. We evaluate the nuclear weapons related policies of all the 197 states that can become party to global treaties that the Secretary General of the UN is the depository for. That means the 193 UN member states, the 2 observers, the Holy See and the State of Palestine, and 2 more states, Cook Islands and Niue. We use the TPNW as a yardstick against which we can measure the progress towards a world without nuclear weapons. But we also track the status of these 197 states in relation to the other relevant treaties and regimes dealing with weapons of mass destruction, including the NPT, Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone treaties, the CTBT, Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological Weapons Convention, Conference on Disarmament, and Comprehensive Safeguards Agreements and additional protocols with the IAEA. We're going to go through now the overall findings in the 2020 report, but I encourage you to take a look at the individual state profiles later. Among other things, they contain summary information on each state's status with respect to all of the treaties I just mentioned, treaties and regimes I just mentioned, as well as latest developments and recommendations. On the website, at the end of each state profile, there's also a report back function so you can help us update them, which we would, of course, appreciate. We have sent some printed copies of the report to the Irish mission in Vienna. I'm sure they can share with people there. But you can also go to our website to download the report or fill in a form there, and we'll send you a printed copy by post. Next slide, please. The context around the TPNW is as important to analyze as the status of the treaty itself. In 2020, 75 years after the first use of nuclear weapons, all the world states still claimed to support nuclear disarmament and the pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons. So that's the starting point. The clear majority, 156 states, had nuclear weapon-free security policies in 2020. So they not only support nuclear disarmament in principle, but also reject nuclear weapons in practice. Despite their long-standing commitment to disarmament, however, a minority of 41 states continued to base their security strategies on the possession and potential use of nuclear weapons. That's the 9 nuclear-armed states and 32 umbrella states. With the arrival of the TPNW, more attention than in the past has been given to the role of umbrella states in enabling nuclear armament and preventing progress towards nuclear disarmament. The treaty constitutes a significant challenge to the legitimacy of nuclear deterrence and for the states that have inconsistent stances on nuclear weapons, because it asks them to choose nuclear weapons, yes or no. So not surprisingly, the political dynamic around the TPNW was one of deep contestation in 2020. Next slide, please. This chart is updated with the most recent numbers on the status of the TPNW. There are now 54 states parties and 34 states that have signed but not yet ratified. So in total, 88 states, or 44% of all states, are either states parties or signatories, and we're approaching a situation where half of all states will have accepted binding obligations in international law under the TPNW. 109 states are not yet states parties or signatories, but of those we categorize 50 as other supporters, because their most recent vote on the TPNW in the UN was in favor of the treaty. Most of those 50 states took part in adopting the treaty in 2017 and have continued to vote yes on the annual UN General Assembly resolution on the TPNW. But there are also some states that didn't participate in the negotiations or didn't take part when the vote took place, but that later have expressed their support by voting yes on the annual resolution. Many of the states in this other supporters group have already started the process to join the TPNW. That's the case, for instance, for Sierra Leone, Eritrea, Andorra. And if we group the states parties, signatories, and other supporters together, we can consider 138 states as supporters of the TPNW. That's exactly 70% of all states. And then there are 42 states, shown in red here, that are opposed to the treaty. They are in this group because their most recent vote in the UN on the TPNW was a no vote. The opposed states are all of the nuclear-armed states and all of the umbrella states that are allies of the US, but also include 3 states that have nuclear-free security policies. That's Bosnia-Herzegovina, Micronesia, and Monaco. Some of the umbrella states in this category are more conflicted on the TPNW than others, though. Political debate on the merits of the treaty is ongoing in several of them. For instance, in Australia, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway. And then finally, there are a total of 17 states, shown in yellow here, that we've listed as undecided because their most recent vote in the UN on the TPNW was an abstention, or because they never participated in such a vote. This is a very mixed group of states, spread out across all 5 continents. Some of them have the treaty under review, others seem to be choosing to stay neutral for the time being. And finally, there are some states that currently, and for various reasons, are not in a position to consider whether to join the treaty. Of the 17 undecided states, it's relevant to mention that 15 have nuclear weapon-free security policies. The last 2 undecided states are Armenia and Belarus, the only 2 states that we've listed in the nuclear weapons ban monitor to have arrangements of extended nuclear deterrence with Russia. Both Armenia and Belarus abstained on the General Assembly resolution on the TPNW in 2018, 2019, and 2020. By contrast, and as I already mentioned, all umbrella states that are allies of the US have so far consistently voted against this resolution. Next slide, please. Breaking down the 138 TPNW supporters by region, we see that support is already high in all regions of the world apart from Europe. In Europe, as many as 31 of the 47 states are opposed to the treaty. And you can see the undecided states in yellow spread out across all regions. Next slide, please. In the course of 2020, 17 states ratified or acceded to the TPNW. So far in 2021, 3 states have ratified. As you can see here, although slower than the NPT, the TPNW speed of ratification and accession has for a long time been the same as for the other treaties on weapons of mass destruction, the CTBT, the Biological Weapons Convention, and the Chemical Weapons Convention. but at exactly 3.5 years after the TPNW opened for signature, you can see that it's just now fallen slightly behind all of the other treaties for the first time, with 54 ratifications and accessions. In the same time period, the NPT had 66 ratifications and accessions, the Biological Weapons Convention 56, the Chemical Weapons Convention 57, and the CTBT 55. Next slide, please. Looking at the level of signatures after 3.5 years, we see that the TPNW is still low compared to the other treaties, with a total of 86 signatures so far. Next slide, please. As Ambassador Kmentt already mentioned, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor evaluates the extent to which all states, regardless of whether they've consented to be bound by the TPNW, act in accordance with its prohibitions or not. For the states parties and signatories, we assess compliance, and for the states not party, we assess compatibility. Our legal experts concluded that in 2020, 135 states, or 77%, maintained policies and practices that were consistent with all the prohibitions of the TPNW. That included all the states that now are states parties or signatories. But 42 states not party were found to engage in conduct that is not compatible with one or more of the prohibitions. That's the 9 nuclear-armed states, which obviously contradict the TPNW in several ways, but also the 32 umbrella states, in addition to 1 state that has a nuclear weapon-free security policy, the Marshall Islands. Any state can sign the TPNW, but these 42 states are the ones that would have to make varying degrees of changes to their policies and practices should they want to be compliant with the treaty. And then in addition, 2 states, Iran and Saudi Arabia, were recorded as states of concern. Stuart will return to that later. Next slide, please. Breaking the compliance and compatibility findings down by region, we see that Europe stands out again. 30 of the 47 states in Europe were found to maintain policies and practices that were not compatible with one or more of the prohibitions. In the other regions, compliance and compatibility were generally high. And now for the interesting part, looking at the findings for each of the specific prohibitions, and Stuart will take over. Thank you for your attention so far, everyone.
Thank you very much, Grethe, for the introduction and overview. And as advertised, I'm pleased next to give floor to Mrs. Stuart Casey-Maslen, who's an honorary professor at the University of Pretoria. Take us through the specifics of prohibitions and compliance.
Thanks very much, Gaukhar. Thanks, of course, to Austria, Ireland, and New Zealand for their support, both to the Monitor and more broadly to Disarmament, and thanks to the Vienna Centre for organising and hosting us today. So I'm going to take you through our interpretation of Articles 1 to 5 of the TPNW and talk about application of those interpretations with respect to Article 1, of course, the prohibitions. I note in the Q&A, there's a very interesting and important question from Tariq Rauf. Dr. Rauf, thank you for joining us. Everyone will know him as one of the leading experts on disarmament. And I will try and respond to your 2 questions. I should emphasize, though, that these would be my own personal opinions because the Monitor is still working on a more detailed legal opinion on this. But in brief, in answer to your first question, it's unlawful. And in answer to your second question, it's probably unlawful if you think about the Holbrooke. And then if you think about the W93, it's almost certainly unlawful. And I will come back to that in my remarks. Slide, please, Noah. So the first prohibitions on development of production, as you can see, all states are involved in some form in development, and all but Israel and the United Kingdom tested missiles for the delivery of nuclear weapons in 2020. Modernization encompasses, falls within, the prohibitions both on development and on production. I don't need to say much about Iran, but I would like to say a couple of remarks about Saudi Arabia. This was described just a couple of months ago by Mark Fitzpatrick as the proliferation concern #1 in the world. And I think all states to the NPT need to take this more seriously. As many of you will know, Saudi Arabia has only a small quantities protocol in force of a type that Director General Grossi has described as simply not adequate. Indeed, we saw the front cover of The Economist just 2 months ago with the title, "Who Will Go Nuclear Next?" That indicates to all of us that there are some serious non-proliferation concerns that must urgently be addressed. Slide, please, Noah. I don't need to comment much on this. As you can see, we've set out the figures, the best figures we have available, of course, Hans Christensen's work published by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, setting out both in terms of deployed and non-deployed weapons. I think we all breathed a collective sigh of relief at the extension of a New START, but that only takes us through to the 5th of February 2026, when the last disarmament agreement between the two nuclear superpowers will expire, and very little optimism about what might, if anything, replace it. Slide, please. So as you know, only one state in the 21st century has test detonated a nuclear weapon, at least to the best of our knowledge. That's back in early September 2017. We suggest that there is either a developing or already a crystallized customary prohibition on explosive testing. We noted with concern the United States' suggestion that they might resume nuclear testing. That would be arguably a violation of customary law, but certainly a violation of the United States' obligations as a signatory to the CTBT. Slide, please. And here I'll come to a little bit more detail of Dr. Ralph's question. So as many of you will know, the Holbrook missile, that's the warhead that the United Kingdom fits into the Trident D5 missiles it leases from the United States, is very closely based on the W76 US variant. And there is great concern that the new warhead that the United Kingdom has announced it will develop will in fact be a carbon copy of the W93, if that is indeed produced. We had the astonishing sign of a British defense minister writing to US Congress last year to ask them to develop the W93. And Admiral Richard, the commander of US Strategic Command, in testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee, saying that the W93 will support a parallel replacement warhead program in the United Kingdom. That, in my legal opinion, is a violation of the NPT. And indeed, in testimony by the Secretary of State for Defense, Ben Wallace, in the House of Commons just last month, he said it would be unlawful to purchase the warhead from the United States. So I think we have great concern about compliance with the NPT, as well as, of course, compatibility with the norm established by the TPNW. Slide, please. The flip side, of course, of the transfer of the weapon or transfer of control of the weapon, those words were, of course, taken from Article 1 of the NPT to ensure consistency and included in Article 1 of the TPNW. The flip side is, of course, seeking assistance. And the United Kingdom is clearly seeking assistance in the development of its future warhead for its nuclear arsenal. We've mentioned the concern of a potential future compatibility issue, because in 4 of the 5 states in which the B-61 is stationed, in the event of an international armed conflict, then these could be released to the 4 host nations, who would themselves use them on a dual arrangement process. And in testimony before the Senate back in 1968, seeking ratification of the NPT, Dean Rusk said that the NPT was just a peacetime treaty, did not apply in armed conflict. I don't think that's the opinion of all the other states parties. Slide, please. The prohibition on use, again, I don't need to say a lot here. We're talking about a detonation in anger, not a test detonation. And thankfully, we've only had 2 horrific experiences in terms of use of nuclear weapons. Of course, you can multiply that by 1,000 in terms of test detonations. Slide, please. In our interpretation in the monitor, we've made it clear our view that nuclear deterrence per se and the prohibition on threatening to use are not synonyms. That said, there are a number of actions, as you can see, that could constitute threatening to use. And if you look at the last issue of a test detonation, I think it's clear that in 1998, the Indian and the Pakistani test detonations were, yes, testing their weapons, but they were also a very overt threat to each other, and arguably by India to China, about a willingness to use nuclear weapons in certain circumstances. Slide, please. As you all know, this prohibition on assisting, encouraging, or inducing has been the one that has, to date at least, provoked the most comment. It's also the prohibition which has been violated, or whose requirement has been violated by the largest number of states. We've listed the 36 who we identified in 2020, and the understanding of this provision, which is taken directly from the Chemical Weapons Convention, repeated in the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, there's an established understanding that has been clarified by state practice. Slide, please. Just note on this issue that there is a slight difference in terms of the other prohibitions compared to the Chemical Weapons Convention. We don't have that prohibition on military preparation for use, as you do have in the Chemical Weapons Convention, but nonetheless, things like participation in nuclear strike exercises are clear encouragement of continued possession. And there's also potentially an overlap with the prohibition in Article 11G on stationing, installation, or deployment of foreign nuclear weapons. The strategic concept, the NATO strategic concept, we believe is clear encouragement to possess and stockpile. Slide, please. So we conclude that it is possible for states parties to the treaty to remain in alliances and military cooperation if they do not involve prohibited activity with respect to nuclear weapons. It would even be possible to plan for assistance after a nuclear strike, because that would be helping to implement one of the positive obligations under the treaty, assistance to victims. Let's hope that is a purely theoretical scenario. Slide, please, Noah. So here you see the 5 states that continue to host nuclear weapons belonging to another state. We hope that the INF Treaty's demise will not lead to the reintroduction of more short and intermediate range missiles into Europe. Slide, please. As you can see, there are, and as you well know, there are positive obligations to implement the treaty, as well as the prohibitions I've just gone through very briefly. Last year, so in the most recent version of the monitor, we talked about the interpretation. As you can see, this year we will apply the interpretations to the conduct of all states parties and all states not party. Slide, please. As you know, the core obligation in terms of reporting is the one set out in Article 2. As you can see, we had 42 out of 50 states meet the deadline. 7 states were a few days late, which is, of course, regrettable. 1 state is still not compliant and is therefore contravening its obligations. 1 more state's obligations will come due in a few days, which, if memory serves me right, is Benin. We had, very importantly, declarations by 2 former nuclear armed states, Kazakhstan and South Africa. In 1991, Kazakhstan was the 4th largest, had the 4th largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It voluntarily renounced that arsenal, became a non-nuclear weapon state party to the NPT. And South Africa, of course, as apartheid was thankfully coming to an end, renounced the small number of nuclear explosive devices that it had developed. Slide, please. Won't go into this in great detail. The important point to note is, despite the spin that some of the nuclear armed states and their allies have attempted to put on it, the bold fact is that the NPT is not stronger on safeguards than the TPNW. It is the reverse. Now, it is also true that the TPNW does not require of every single state party that they conclude an additional protocol. And I hope, and the monitor hopes, that there will be a clear recommendation by the first meeting of states parties that every state party, including those that are not bound by Article 3 or Article 4 to conclude or maintain in force an additional protocol, are strongly encouraged to do so. Slide, please. We do have, of course, through the INF, through Start 1, a lot of expertise that has been gathered on very detailed verification for disarmament. Those of you who haven't yet done so, I would strongly recommend Thomas Shea's excellent work on verifying nuclear disarmament. And Thomas was very kindly a contributor to the monitor last year. The first meeting of states parties is required by the treaty to set a deadline for any state, any nuclear armed state that joins it, for the destruction and elimination of its nuclear weapons program. As you can see, we suggest a renewable deadline of 10 years following experience in other treaties. Slide, please. Also required is the deadline for the removal of foreign weapons, and this should be, we believe, a much shorter deadline. We've suggested no more than 3 years. That is in itself quite a generous deadline. Slide, please. Regrettably, only 1 state party, Ireland, has adopted legislation specifically to implement the TPNW. Now, of course, there are many states that are party to nuclear weapon free zone treaties and have adopted legislation in relation to that. But I think we congratulate Ireland for its Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Act 2019 and encourage all other states to do so. And with that, I'll pass over to Dr. Docherty. Thank you very much, Gaukhar.
Thank you very much for a very comprehensive overview and already answering in part some of the questions that were coming in from other channels, as well as the Q&A. And speaking of questions, some of you have been submitting questions in chat. Please copy your question to the Q&A using the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so that would make it much easier for us to see all the questions and pose them to the panelists. And now I'm indeed pleased to turn to our next speaker, with Ms. Bonnie Docherty, Associate Director and Lecturer at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Gaukhar. And I want to thank VCDNP for hosting this event, and also the ambassadors of Austria, New Zealand, and Ireland for the, we appreciate your welcoming remarks, and of course, your country's support of the monitor. So next slide, please. In addition to the more technical provisions or positive obligations that Stuart discussed, the TPNW also includes positive obligations to promote universalization of the treaty and to address the harm caused by nuclear weapons in the past. Article 12 of the TPNW requires states to, quote, encourage states party to sign or ratify the treaty. It does not specify how states parties should encourage universalization and gives them the flexibility to choose the most effective method. The 2020 Monitor States Profiles highlight statements made and actions taken to implement this obligation. The 2021 Monitor will continue to collect such information as well as assess compliance with Article 12. And I'll note that any state party that discourages adherence will be identified as non-compliant. Next slide, please. Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW were motivated by the harm caused by nuclear weapons. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and more than 2,050 nuclear tests that followed have caused devastating human and environmental consequences. As you know, they cause horrific injuries at the time of detonation and have left a legacy of long-term health effects, such as cancer and birth defects, which disproportionately affect women and girls, as well as psychological trauma. Radioactive fallout has contaminated water, farmland, fisheries, and hunting grounds, damaging the environment, interfering with food security, and endangering local residents. Some communities, especially indigenous ones, have been displaced altogether. While this harm has all been well documented, it's necessary to have a comprehensive survey of this damage and the resulting needs, and that should be a priority for TPNW states parties. Next slide, please. To address these consequences, Article 6 requires states parties to assist and remediate the environment affected by use and testing. Article 7, which I'll discuss in a minute, requires other states parties to help them achieve these goals. This package of provisions is essential to the TPNW's humanitarian purpose because it ensures that the treaty represents a comprehensive response to the harm caused by nuclear weapons. While other articles of the TPNW work to prevent future detonations, Articles 6 and 7 work together to respond to the harm already occurred. Article 6.1 obliges states to assist affected individuals under their jurisdiction. Its holistic approach to victim assistance requires a range of types of assistance, including medical care, rehabilitation, and psychological support, as well as measures to ensure the socioeconomic inclusion of affected individuals. Assistance must be provided with a sensitive to differences in age and gender, and it must be applied without discrimination. The end goal is to ensure that victims can realize their human rights. To make victim assistance more manageable, Article 6.1 can be understood to allow affected states to progressively realize some of their obligations, particularly those on economic, social, and cultural rights. International human rights law requires states to take steps to achieve those rights while recognizing that full realization is a gradual process. Article 6.2 focuses on addressing the environmental damage caused by nuclear weapons. It obliges states parties to, quote, take necessary and appropriate measures towards the remediation of contaminated areas. The remediation should be understood to encompass measures to contain or remove contamination or to reduce exposure through measures such as marking and fencing dangerous areas or conducting risk reduction education. In requiring measures towards environmental remediation, it recognizes that in most cases, the environment cannot be returned to its pre-detonation state. It mandates that steps be taken to clean affected areas and reduce further exposure, but unlike earlier treaties, it does not set a specific deadline for completion. Next slide, please. Article 6 must be read in conjunction with Article 7 on international cooperation and assistance, because together they create a framework of shared responsibility for victim assistance and environmental remediation. Article 6 requires affected states parties to play the lead role in these activities. Practically, they are best positioned to understand the needs of their people and to distribute assistance. Similarly, they have better access to affected areas, which facilitates assessments of contamination and actions to remediate the environment. The approach also protects the sovereignty of affected states and gives them agency in addressing matters within their borders. And it follows the precedent of past humanitarian disarmament treaties, such as the Mine Ban Treaty and Convention on Cluster Munitions, as well as international human rights law, which in general requires states to take care of their own people. But, and this is an essential part of the TPNW, the treaty does not place the sole responsibility on affected states. Article 7 requires all states parties to cooperate to facilitate implementation of the treaty. It obliges states parties in a position to do so, to provide assistance to help affected states parties, both assist victims and remediate the environment. Donor states may provide assistance in a range of forms: technical support in the form of medical, scientific, or environmental expertise, material support, including healthcare or remediation equipment, and financial support to support affected states parties programs. As a result, we believe that almost all states parties should be in a position to assist in some way. The TPNWs does not absolve the states that used and tested nuclear weapons. Article 7.6 ensures that user and testing state parties have legal as well as moral obligations to address the harm they caused. It explicitly places an obligation on them to provide adequate assistance for victim assistance and environmental remediation. In addition, it's worth noting that nothing in the TPNW precludes an affected state or individual from seeking redress or compensation through other means. And existing compensation arrangements are unaltered by the TPNW's obligations. Next slide, please. Now that the TPNW has entered into force, states parties should begin to put their victim assistance and environmental remediation provisions into practice and prepare to use the first meeting of states parties to advance implementation. They can look to the international law and national practice for guideline. The Mine Ban Treaty and Convention on Cluster Munitions are particularly important precedent because TPNW Articles 6 and 7 draw heavily from them. TPNW states parties should take a series of practical steps in the near term, such as developing a national plan and budget, appointing a government focal point, and adopting relevant laws and practices. They should also collect and disseminate information about the threats posed contamination and the needs of victims. In addition, states parties should be guided by certain fundamental principles that have been widely accepted in the landmine and cluster mission contexts. In particular, inclusion of affected individuals, communities, and their representatives, non-discrimination, and transparency to ensure monitoring, evaluation, and accountability. As the Monitor notes, publications by Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic provide a more in-depth discussion of implementation of these provisions. The first meeting of states parties is a key moment to advance these and other elements of the treaty. States parties, for example, can reaffirm their commitment to victim assistance, environmental remediation, and international cooperation and assistance in a political declaration. They can lay out some concrete implementation steps in an action plan, and they should establish intersessional standing committees to address all three areas in more depth. In particular, the committee should address needs assessments and programmatic responses. In conclusion, I just want to note that the treaty's framework of shared responsibility opens up new sources of support for affected states parties that do not depend on the treaty's ratification by nuclear armed states. And furthermore, these provisions can set norms for states not party to the TPNW. Affected states that have yet to join the treaty can look for guidance to its provisions and implementation measures as they address the effects of nuclear weapons in their territory. And states not party, as been shown by evidence with other treaties, can often provide support in accordance with the international cooperation and assistance obligations. So with this point, I'll turn it back to Gaukhar, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you, Dr. Docherty, and to all the speakers. We have lots and lots of questions already, and I've tried my best to group them as much as possible into categories so that I don't pose them one at a time. And with your and our audience's indulgence, we might go a bit over time trying to answer at least some of the questions that were submitted. I'd like to start with a group of questions that has to do with the first meeting of states parties. There's been quite a number of them. And so one is about the objectives, the main objectives of the first meeting of states parties. The next one is about the role for observers, for possible role for observer states in both the preparations for the meeting of states parties and the meeting itself. And how can the states parties to the TPNW engage some of those undecided states and sort of encourage them to participate as observers? Somewhat related, but a bit different question is about how to involve the nuclear weapon states in the discussions, considering that both, I'm trying to read here, that both the core argument of both nuclear deterrence and the ban treaty emphasizes the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So for the supporters of nuclear deterrence, that's basically the major effect, right? That the use of nuclear weapons would be so horrible, nobody would act in a way as to provoke it. Whereas for the TPNW supporters, this is the argument to prohibit nuclear weapons and eliminate them. And finally, there's a question about the role for civil society at this stage in terms of preparations of events for the meeting of states parties and contributing to research in advance of the meeting. I'm willing to take volunteers to take up on these questions. The first obvious one would be, of course, Alexander Kmentt as the president designate, but any of the other speakers are, of course, welcome to contribute as well. Let's start with you then, Alexander.
Thank you, Gaukhar. If we have another hour, we can address all these questions in detail. I run through as quickly as I can objectives of the first meeting of states parties. There are some formal aspects that have to be dealt with. We have to discuss the general implementation of the treaty. We have a few decisions. Stuart had mentioned them on the deadlines for destruction, on the deadline for removal. There are these there is the formal menu of what we have to do, but then of course the objective is also a political objective. The objective is to demonstrate the seriousness, as I mentioned in my presentation of the TPNW, is to highlight the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the risk dimension, to come up with a strong political message from this meeting for universalization, for further progress on disarmament. So it's a broad range of objectives. I have to say that we have not yet discussed this in any great detail in the consultation process so far, and I guess the views and expectations of states parties will become clearer and more concrete in the course of the next few months. Role of observers. Again, we still have to decide on the rules of procedure, but my expectation is that we will apply, by and large, the rules of procedures that we've had for the negotiation conference with a couple of changes. So observers will be welcome. I think, of course, that is the part of the key purpose of the TPNW is to engage on the arguments on which the TPNW is based, and that's already the third question. How can states parties engage with undecided states? It's a recognition. The TPNW, as Eoin said in his presentation, is partly the result, or largely the result, of the unfulfilled nuclear disarmament obligations under the NPT. So the TPNW probably would not exist if that implementation would have been, if there would have been much more focus. So the way of engaging across the divide, if you want to use this expression, is to engage on the arguments, on the humanitarian consequences and risks, and what we know today about the consequences, and what do we know today about the risk that come with the possession of nuclear weapons. What conclusions can be drawn for the security value of these weapons? And that is, of course, the core issue of the debate on nuclear weapons. And I believe, I'm very confident, in fact, that the arguments around which the TPNW is built is that, given that the consequences are far greater than we have thought, and there is lots of research to back this up, and the risks are much more complex and complicated and rising, that the security calculus of nuclear deterrence becomes ever more shaky. So that is the discussion that needs to be had, and I hope that the TPNW, but not only the TPNW, will be a framework for this discussion to have. Then there's an interesting question on how to engage, because both those who believe in deterrence and those who believe in the TPNW put the humanitarian consequences at the forefront. And that, I think, is a very important point, because in the deterrence context, the humanitarian consequences argument is made as an argument for deterrence, meaning that these weapons will then not be used. Whereas what we've done in the TPNW is said, okay, that's fine, let's hope it stays that way, but what happens if that calculation is wrong? And how likely is it that this calculation is wrong? Yes, we both talk about humanitarian consequences, but it's, in my view, it's extremely short-sighted to talk about humanitarian consequences in the context of non-use, because the whole purpose of nuclear deterrence is to be credible in terms of using these weapons. And if you want to be credible in terms of using these weapons, you also have to be engaging in a discussion on what actually happens if these weapons are used, and how risky is it that we will actually get to use. And I think that is an extremely important discussion that is simply not taking place in the NPT context or in the other framework. And hopefully in the TPNW context, we can have that. And I think the TPNW clearly is a demand by the vast majority of states to have this discussion, to stop brushing these key arguments under the carpet. And role of civil society, lastly, plenty of ways of engaging. Civil society in all forms have been close partners, and all states parties with whom we've spoken so far have expressed their wish that they welcome the participation and the contribution of civil society, and we will make sure that the first meeting of states parties will provide ample opportunity for this kind of engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that Ambassador Roberton would need to leave in about 6 minutes. So if you have any remarks to respond to the questions, then please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I mean, I can only endorse all of the comments that Ambassador Kmentt has already made. There was a specific comment or question that was posed to me in the Q&A I saw about the consistency, I think it was, between engagement between the Stockholm Initiative and the TPNW. And I think this goes to the broader point about engagement. And I want to caveat this heavily that I am not the person that is involved in the Stockholm Initiative. That's very much our Geneva team and our Wellington team, not here in Vienna. But as a personal comment, I think what's fantastic about the TPNW is that it is a focal point for conversations and for pushing these issues forward. And I don't think it's intended to create separate tracks and different teams of people. I think the more that we have these conversations in as many contexts as we can have them, then they're more important. And as Alexander has just pointed out, you know, we have a shared objective of the horrendous humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So we need to be able to talk to as many people as we can in as many fora. So I would see it actually is very important to be engaging in as many fora as we can, and not to draw distinctions, because the conversations are important. So I hope that helps answer that question. And other than that, I think Alexander has covered everything off beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for addressing that question in particular. And it's worth noting that quite a number of states are parties to different initiatives, and New Zealand, of course, is an active member of the New Agenda Coalition as well. So does anyone from the Ban Monitor team want to take on the first meeting of states parties questions, or are we happy to move on to the next one? You're nodding, Grethe, which is a yes to one of my questions. Okay, all right. So actually, then there was a question posed to the monitor team, and that is about the conduct of research and the challenges associated with gathering the data for this kind of work. And it's a massive amount of work. I have the actual publication here. You can't see it online, but it's really a lot. So if are there any particular aspects of this research and work that you'd like to highlight as challenging? Yes, Grethe, please.
Yes, as you say, it is a massive amount of work. We inherited from the previous International Law and Policy Institute a database that they'd been working on for quite some time on all of these different treaties and regimes that we have continued to build on, and it has almost 200,000 entries now, and is a huge resource, well beyond the nuclear weapons ban monitors needs. In case there are researchers out there, we can pull very interesting historical and current data. So the data set work is a big part of this. I would say that we use only open source information, so it's all out there. It's more about applying the lens of the TPNW, which means that I actually believe that we are looking at a lot of the information in a different way and presenting it with the focus that the TPNW requires. That's the main difference. But that with regards to some issues like on assistance and encouragement, like technical and logistical support to nuclear weapons, to participation in nuclear exercises, we haven't really done any much research yet. We have focused on the legal interpretations of those types of activities that we know are going on, but not so much on which state does what. This is also going to be very difficult because there's not much openness around those issues. But we will focus more on that in the future. But I would also say that the more important point than saying exactly this state is doing something wrong is to present the information clearly about these are types of policies and practices that states will need to change if they want to comply by the standards set by the TPNW. And then, as Stuart mentioned, this will be the first year now in 2021 that we start assessing compliance and compatibility with the positive obligations of the treaty, and that's going to be much more demanding on us. We're going to have to ask for information from states and hope for responses and cooperation from them. And then I would also like to stress the point that Bonnie made, that actually for good monitoring of the positive obligations on victim assistance and environmental remediation, what we need is a global survey of the harm that has taken place so far, and the associated needs for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And it's actually shocking that no comprehensive global overview exists already today after decades of knowing that this harm is there. It's not easy to put together an overview of the global situation, but it should be done. And this is an important point where the supporters of the TPNW and states that are not ready to join it yet, where they can and should cooperate. Thanks.
Thank you very much. proceeding also on some of the actual provisions, prohibitions and interpretations, there was a question that was answered by Stuart in writing, but I wonder if anyone else wants to weigh in, and it has to do with interpretation of the prohibition of threat of use, which in the interpretation of the ban monitor covers the immediate sort of credible threat issued by somebody who can carry it out, which from the perspective of the person asking the question kind of lets off the hook some of the states who are NATO members, for example, but they don't have nuclear weapons on their territories and don't have control of the nuclear weapons. Sort of the motivation for this kind of interpretation, and if there are any thoughts from the states parties on the interpretation of the prohibition on the threat of use. And another question that has to do, it can be either prohibitions or positive obligations. What happens if a state is not compliant? First of all, what is, I understand there hasn't been a meeting of states parties yet, but what is the thinking about the finding of non-compliance and the response to action? I'm happy to take volunteers. And as I said, Stuart has already typed some of the answer to the question about the threat of use in the chat, in the Q&A. But any additional comments on that?
Can I just add to that, Gaukhar,
yes,
if I
absolutely.
may? So what we're not saying is that this is lawful. What we're saying is this is captured by a different prohibition in Article 1. And as I mentioned, if you are a NATO member and if you support the strategic concept, or indeed if you do not disassociate your country from the strategic concept and specifically the affirmation that NATO is a nuclear alliance, then you are violating Article 1. What I think it's important to do, and what we've done in the monitor to date, is to not try to expand our understanding of the obligations. Now, states parties will tell us if we've got something wrong. They're the guardians of the treaty, of course. But on the one hand, we're not saying that subscribing and seeking support through a nuclear umbrella for your country is lawful. But on the other hand, we don't want to expand. And just to reiterate, it is threatening to use. The formulation was chosen by the negotiating states with great care. This is not a generic threat of force, Article 2.4. This is a more specific prohibition with good reason. But for me, Article 1 is well crafted because it covers all the things that we want to do without being impossible to implement. So I actually think the states parties were comprehensive, but were realistic. You can't check every plane that flies over your territory, for example, to see whether they might have a nuclear weapon somewhere. That's just not feasible. So realistic, comprehensive, and clear. And I think that's where the states parties did very well.
Thank you, Stuart. On the question of compliance and finding non-compliance, reacting to non-compliance, if I may pick on the state party representatives at this stage, what's preliminary thinking like around these issues? Ambassador Leary or Ambassador Kmentt?
I would just like to say that this is an issue that will have to be discussed in the consultations, in the preparations, and we haven't done that yet. So I would be hesitant of making comments now in my personal capacity, because this is, of course, a key issue that needs to be discussed in the context of the preparations.
What about the recommendations from the ban monitor? What to do about states whom you find in non-compliance? All right.
I was hoping for Stuart. I think I'm
happy to say a few things. Obviously, not a state as a academic, but I think the first step is confirming that a violation has occurred. And what we've tried to do in the monitor, as Grethe explained, is to be very clear about how we interpret a provision. So any state party and any state indeed that reads it will understand the basis for our interpretation. So that's the first step. The second step, of course, is applying that to the facts. And we have not found for 2020 that any state party violated the provisions, which of course came into force in January of this year. This year, we will be very clear. If any state engages in conduct that violates the treaty, then we will flag it up. And the worst that we can say so far is that 7 states were late in providing their Article 2 declaration. That's a violation of the treaty. We will flag it up. 1 is engaged in an ongoing violation, Dominica, and we will flag that up in event of any other states that don't meet their forthcoming obligations. So I think it really is a step-by-step approach. Interpret clearly, make sure that everyone agrees to the interpretation, apply it to the facts, and then, only then, if we found that there's a violation, is there a need for some form of compliance? But I think it is clear, if you are a state that is either nuclear armed or wants to support a nuclear armed state with what we would regard as illegitimate activity, you don't join the TPNW. Why would you do that? What possible benefit would accrue to you? Because you are at the very least going to attract opprobrium and criticism and condemnation. So I actually don't think that lack of compliance is going to be the issue. Our challenge is to increase the number of states parties and to move towards universality. That's by far the bigger challenge, not the issue of compliance, in my opinion. But Bonnie may have some views, and Grethe, of course, on this as well.
Yes, please go ahead.
I agree with everything Stuart said. I would just add that, one, and I agree that universalization is going to be the bigger challenge than compliance. I think in terms of enforcement, one, as judging by past treaties, stigmatization is one of the big factors here. It's less sort of legal ramifications than the political pressure put on states parties for not, as Stuart said, drawing, they will draw a program if they are found to be out of compliance with the treaty. So I just want to reiterate the importance of that, and that stigma can also then, even if it's incompatibility rather than non-compliance, infect states not party as well.
Very, very well, thank you. I think this emphasizes the whole origin of the TPNW being really about the normative impact, and so the strength of stigmatization and a bit of shaming associated with not living up to the obligations is an important factor here. The question that Casey tried to answer in his remarks, the attendees could not see what the question was, so I'll just briefly flag that and see if anybody wants to respond to it before we close. And it has to do about the UK's recent decision to increase its nuclear warhead cap, and also the UK cooperation with the United States on warhead design information for the new SLBM warheads. Do you assess that? How would you assess the impact of those decisions and those activities on the NPT? And sort of to continue with the NPT question, with the NPT issue, there's questions about your expectations for a best case scenario at the NPT review conference that's tentatively scheduled for August 2021.
Can I dive in again, Gaukhar, the risk of monopolizing?
Absolutely.
A couple of things. Firstly, Johannes asked about what are our expectations. I think let's lower our expectations. What must not happen is there must not be backsliding. We have very clear commitments from 95, from 2000, of the review conferences on what states parties to the NPT are required to do, in particular in relation to Article 6. And that leads perfectly into your question about increasing the arsenals. In 2000, the review conference was absolutely clear. Reductions in nuclear arsenals are irreversible. That was the acceptance by all the states parties. That is their interpretation of Article 6 of the NPT. And to suddenly decide with a vague justification of less than a sentence that the United Kingdom needs to increase its nuclear arsenal is not just unlawful, it is reckless. And I hope that in August, you will hear a very clear chorus of states parties to the NPT saying both those words, unlawful and reckless. This is not taking us forward towards a nuclear free world. And if I may abuse the floor for 1 second, I just wanted to support Ambassador Labe's suggestion of a new advisory opinion on the legality of nuclear weapons. I think the time is becoming ripe for such an advisory opinion and to rectify and clarify some of the issues with the 96 version in relation to proportionality under IHL, in relation to non-international armed conflict, in relation to reprisals, in relation to deterrence, and relation to extreme self-defense, whatever that means. I think that would be another step forward in our armory towards a nuclear-free world. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Kmentt, please.
Thanks. On the NPT question, I would endorse what Stuart just said on the backsliding. I think that is extremely important, and that, of course, applies to the whole treaty, but I think it applies particularly to, with respect to the disarmament commitments, specifically those of the year 2000 and the NPT action plan of 2010. So at a minimum, I think it would be extremely important for the NPT to recommit to those principles. On the UK decision, I would also like to say that from an NPT point of view, in conjunction to the in relation to the commitments agreed to by consensus in 2000 and 2010, there are several aspects of the UK decision which are problematic. It's not just raising the ceiling; it's also a change in doctrine, and there are some clear decisions have been taken in 2010 to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security doctrines and others that Stuart has mentioned. So I think it's important to engage with the UK to discuss how these steps are to be interpreted, other than being in contravention to those principles that have been agreed to by consensus by all states parties. So I think it's an extremely important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Later, please.
Yes, Gaukhar, just to second what Alexander has said there, that the NPT should at least preserve the gains and the progress we've made, and aim indeed to achieve more. As we know, in the week that's in it, there are talks going on about the JCPOA, and we have all of us have a vested interest in making sure that that particular agreement comes back into force as quickly as possible. While this very useful conference has been going on, a document that just hit my in-tray, a joint study by Carnegie and the Institute of International Studies in Shanghai, about the interaction between cyber and nuclear, where cyber conflict could actually trigger a nuclear conflict. I haven't read it, but you know, that points towards the need for a very comprehensive NPT that looks at the new risks that are developing, because we live in an increasingly technologically advanced world where issues like artificial intelligence and use of artificial weapons and cyber could all inadvertently even lead to real nuclear conflict. And we need, I think, as an international organization to work on every level to achieve the ultimate aim that everybody has combined or has committed to, which is the removal of nuclear weapons in their entirety. And just to reassert again that we have a small number of copies. Sean O'Ryan has given his email, first come, first served. So if anybody wants a physical copy of the excellent nuclear ban monitor, they should send Sean an email immediately, I think, because we have a small number of copies and they will be gone very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My sincere gratitude to all the speakers today and to all the attendees, especially those who stayed on past the allocated time. It's been a very lively discussion with lots of interesting questions, which is clearly a testament to a great interest in the treaty, in its implementation, and in the work of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. So special thanks to the researchers putting together this really truly impressive piece of work. With that, if I may, I'll hand it back to Elena to close the webinar.
Gaukhar, you're more than welcome to close it yourself, but I just want to echo your sentiment and thank all our speakers today, and wish everyone to continue to stay healthy and safe in this environment. And hopefully, Alexander, in January for the meeting, we could at least have it in person for the first meeting of state parties. But in the meantime, all the best to you, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.